Everybody, this is Tina Ramirez. I'm so excited to be here with my friend Tatiana Moon. She is somebody that I've known for over 14 years in Washington, D.C. through my work in the world of religious freedom. And I can still remember when I first met her at the Washington Times Foundation at an event, actually. And it was such a special time to hear her speak because I felt like I was hearing from, some royal princess out of Korea that was sharing this beautiful vision for the world. And I thought I want to be a part of that. And so it's been a really fun journey over the last 14 years to get to know Tatiana, to know her work, and to know it in so many different aspects. I was just at her ballet academy a few weeks ago up in Washington, D.C., where she's the president and chair of the Kirov Academy for ballet. It's an amazing academy. She's doing wonderful things with students, not only in the United States, but all around the world. And so it was great to be up there with you, Tatiana, and I'm just so excited to have you with me here today. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you to you, Tina. I've known you for such a long time and have been a great admirer of your work in the realm of religious freedom and human rights. And I'm just really honored to be sharing this time with you this morning.
Thank you. Well, so one of the things that makes this so interesting is that your father and mother represented the Unification Church, or started the Unification Church worldwide. And so growing up in that gave you a really interesting perspective on the world. And I've gotten to know members of the church over the last 2 decades since I've been working in Washington, D.C. And one of the greatest things about getting to know people in the church is that they're from all over the world, from so many different nationalities and backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And that was really part of your father's vision. And it's, in this day and age where people are really struggling with understanding how to live in a pluralistic society, I feel like you had a front row seat to that. When your father first started the church in the 50s, mm-hmm. I think a lot of people don't know a lot about the Unification Church. And so tell me a little bit about what was he preaching about? What was he teaching people back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Korea? What was he teaching?
Well, my father was a devout Christian in that he is a follower of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ came to him on Easter Sunday when in the middle of his prayer, when he was 16 years old, and asked him to finish his mission. And so at the time, he tells us that he said, I'm just not worthy to continue your work. And so please do not choose me. But supposedly, Jesus asked him again and again, and finally he accepted. And so my father's understanding of completing the mission of Jesus Christ was that Jesus Christ was not meant to be crucified on the cross 2,000 years ago. In fact, Jesus was supposed to find a wife, to get married or blessed before God, and to create a model family to inspire other children of God to follow in his steps. So the difference between our faith and Christianity is that in Christianity, Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection is hallmark of Christian faith. But in the Unification Church, we feel that in a way, the Jesus story should have continued. It should not have ended with the crucifixion. And he should have gone on to have a family of his own.
And how did he, a major aspect that most people know about the church were these mass weddings. Can you share a little bit about his vision for bringing people together and what that looked like?
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting how the word mass is attached to weddings. I think it's in the West, every wedding is about me. It's my wedding with the two couples. But in the East, weddings are a family affair. And so in the East, there is no concept of my. You don't choose your own spouse. You don't make any decisions regarding your wedding. Your parents do all of that. So it's very much the family. So in Asia, there have already been kind of a historical mass weddings, if you will, with different people in each village wanting to be married together. And so my father kind of took that concept and basically introduced an understanding of marriage, or what he calls the blessing, as not a my event, or my meaning me and my spouse, but it's really meant to, first of all, honor God, then to pledge before God, and to really thank God. And so you see all these couples after the marriage ceremony saying manse, you know, and I think the press kind of loved that because it looked like, you know, almost like a military kind of a salutation of manse, but it literally means 10,000 years of peace. And you're celebrating your gratitude, you're celebrating your commitment, not just to your spouse, but to the family. But ultimately, you're celebrating your commitment before God.
I was muted. I think it's always so helpful for people to have a bigger perspective of what is the teaching, what do they believe, because part of what, when your dad came here hoping he could simply tell people what he believed and preach in the way he wanted to, and then, like you shared, he was attacked for it and people said this is a cult. And really, regardless of those theological differences, as you said, our First Amendment does protect the right for people to believe whatever they want, even if you disagree with them. And so he was hopeful that he was coming to this environment where he would have that freedom, which he didn't have back home, where he was in prison, like you said, and mistreated. And so coming here, it must have been a huge just disappointment. I don't think is strong enough, but it must have been very hard for him to see that culture of respect for the First Amendment that he thought would exist in many ways didn't. How did he feel about that, and about what was happening to him, and how he was attacked with tax evasion over something that, like you said, a lot of communities would just get a slap on the hand with?
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing about my father, no matter what happens to him, he has never wavered in his gratitude to God. So no matter what he had to go through, he felt like, okay, if I want me to go to prison, there must be a reason. And so while he was in prison, he really rallied all the ministers on behalf of religious freedom. And so I remember I was 18 years old, but I was asked by my father to be his mouthpiece and to really go around the country and work with other Christian leaders, other faith groups, to reiterate the importance of religious freedom in this country. And so my father felt that whether something was negative or positive, whatever was done to him, that there was always hand of God guiding through all of the things that he did. And so a lot of the ministers that I worked with later in my life, we became friends because of those rallies and because of the friendships that were made during the time when my father was in prison. And so we have that to thank. I got to work very closely with Dr. Flowery, who was basically the right hand of Martin Luther King. And so I learned a great deal about the civil rights movement. And, he's a very, very interesting man, and he loved to crack jokes all the time. And he would just all, leave us in stitches most of the time. And he used to say, Ian, Jan, God works in mysterious ways. And he was basically saying, don't try to second guess or third guess God. And so he says, I don't know why I feel compelled to work with Reverend Moon, but I'm drawn to him for some reason. So don't second and third guess it. Sure, he's heard all the things about our movement. Sure, he's heard all the things about brainwashing, and, Cult Awareness Network has done a wonderful job of putting the wrong image on the work of my father. But my father, he agreed with my father in that America was a melting pot. And the good thing about these mass weddings was the fact that you had men and women, sons and daughters from all nations, all faiths, all colors, coming together before God. And that was a good thing, because in our church, we'd have no concept of color. I grew up with, South Korea is a very homogeneous country. Everybody dresses the same. Everybody looks the same, But coming to this country, everybody's different. And it's cool to be different. We celebrate our differences, our uniqueness. And with this mass wedding, we are celebrating our differences, and yet at the same time celebrating our common denominator, which is we are all children of God. So let's get over the difficulties, for instance, like a Japanese brother in our movement being married to a German sister, or Japanese sister being married to a Korean brother. Korea and Japan have had very difficult relationship. We were seen as enemy countries, and still there's a lot of hostility. There are still parents in Korea who absolutely refuses to see your spouse if your spouse happens to be Japanese. But all of that is slowly changing. And I think all of these international blessing ceremonies or mass weddings definitely had a hand at really introducing the concept of a world that's beyond our nationality and our faith and our color. And so for that, I'm very, very grateful for my parents' work.
It's so interesting because we are literally having these conversations every day in America right now with with the racial tensions, with now Asian violence against Asian Americans, and it's been there, and it's just coming to the forefront right now, where people are having these conversations, tough conversations about it. But it's so interesting. I had no idea that your father and you were involved with these civil rights heroes from that went all the way back to the 50s with Martin Luther King. So it's amazing to me that they stood alongside you and your father and his work, seeing that what he was doing was trying to, in many ways, unite people of different cultures and to help them see the humanity in one another, their common humanity, and to overcome so much of the divisions that exist in the world. And sadly, he had seen what happened between North and South Korea and how it was just torn apart and divided. And this desire to see people unified or overcome these racial and ethnic and tribal differences is so valuable. And it's something that, look, like literally 50 years later, we're still struggling with, but he was at the forefront of saying there is a different way. And there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from that I'm sure that you've been able to share with people. So I would love to hear just, as you're looking at what's happening in our own country and the struggle, what are some of the things that you would tell people about understanding different cultures, overcoming those kind of racial divisions, and seeing the dignity of one another. When you have racial slurs and other things thrown at you, how are you, in the work that you're doing around the world and here in America, how do you help them have better conversations about this? How do you share your perspective with them?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's very, very difficult to try to solve centuries-long problem. So it's not going to be done. The solving of these racial tensions is not going to be done overnight. And so just like what you're doing with me, Tina, we've never really talked in depth about my faith or my father or, you know, how I grew up or anything like that. We've worked together in the fight for religious freedom, but we've never really talked about it. But what's really amazing about you is you do make that first step, right? You do extend that hand of invitation and say, come and talk to me. Let me get to know you a little bit. And I think it's things like this, exactly what you are doing, right? Start inviting people that nobody wants to talk to. Let me hear you out. What are you thinking? What's our common denominator? How can we move our relationship forward? Everybody is concentrating on what happened in the past. We cannot change the past. We have to be cognizant of it, recognize that not such good things were done in the past, but we have to concentrate on what we can do now and how we can make it better moving forward. So what I would like to see more and more is a positive message or a positive way of speaking to each other. Let's put the past behind. What can we do today that will make the world tomorrow? And so what you're doing, just simply reaching out, communicating, wanting to hear from me, my perspective, my experience, makes me feel validated as a person, like I matter to you, you know? And I think many times people don't feel heard, don't feel like they matter. They're invisible in a sense. And so they have to act out loudly and more extreme because at the heart of it, they feel that they're not heard. And so when you create opportunities for people to be heard and for people to be understood, there's a natural kind of a strengthening of bond that just takes place that is going to help us work towards the next step and the step after that.
Yeah. When it's so interesting. I remember a few years ago, well, I think it was in 2018, we started this challenge as part of Hardwired, challenging students to take 18 steps towards Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. And so every month we put out a new challenge. And at the end of 2018, we had this big gala where we had a conference where we invited all the young people to join us. And we did a training simulation like what we do around the world with them. But it was kind of like the culminating event. And it was like a special opportunity for them to come and share with leaders in the religious freedom world to learn more about this issue. And one of the challenges, actually a couple of different challenges, were related to facing your fears and interacting with people that believe differently from you. Because so much of the challenge is just that no one wants to have hard conversations or get to know people that are different, ask people what they believe that's different. They're afraid of it. Or like you said, somebody sees you walking in the park and they call you a racial slur and assume something of you. You're an American. There's nowhere to go back to. You're, Maryland or New York, you take your pick. But around the world, I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, people are constantly identified not only by their race, but by their religion everywhere in the world. So you have these identity cards in many countries, and your religion is on that identity card, and you are judged based on whatever religious, ethnic, or tribal group you're part of. And here in America, you would think that we get beyond that we'd see people based on what's inside. But sadly, so often we fall in the same trap. It might not be religion, it might be race, it might just be the color of your skin. And then that's how you're judged. And so with these students a few years ago, we challenged them. We had like several different challenges. One of them was, uh, go to the grocery store to, in your normal goings about, find somebody that that you can get to know that comes from a different culture than you. So I remember being in a Target grocery store and there was this really tall African guy there. And I thought, I bet he's from Sudan. And I'm pretty familiar with the Sudanese culture. And so I said, hi, sir. He was unstacking, I think, Coke at the time. And I said, can I ask where you're from? Just your background. He said, oh, I'm from Darfur. And I said, oh, that's so funny. I was thinking you were from Sudan. So he was from Darfur. And I said, what's your story? And it was so fascinating to me. And I've been to other, like there's a convenience store around the corner where the gentleman is from India. And so we were talking about India. And, Americans come from so many different parts of the world, and all of them carry a story. And often that story involves things like what your family came from, where they didn't have the kind of freedoms that we have here. And they want that kind of freedom, and they came and they want to share it. And so instead of looking at people and judging them, get to know their stories. And that is what I've loved doing all throughout my life. But we encourage these young students to do it. One of the other things that we encouraged these students to do was to go down to the monuments in Richmond, Virginia, where we're based, and to have tough conversation about the monuments. And this was pre, all the racial tensions, but obviously those things were always there. And we said, go down to the monuments and talk to somebody about why they like them or don't like them, and share your opinion, and have a difference of opinion and share it. And just learn to be comfortable hearing somebody else's perspective and not being afraid of it, trying to understand it and trying to help them understand you. But those basic things of just getting to know people, not prejudging, asking people about their stories, facing your fears, having tough conversations, and not being afraid that even if that somehow disagreements are a bad thing, but being able to agree to disagree, because freedom of thought and conscience is all about, we can't all believe the same way, and we're never going to. So we've got to be comfortable agreeing to disagree. So those are some of the components of things that we did with these students. And it was so sad to me to see last year in Richmond, where I live, what happened in our city, where there was so much violence. These statues were torn down, and regardless of whether you agree or not agree with it, that wasn't the point. But that people really, it was the example of how people were failing to have those tough conversations, and to treat other people with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are, what they believe, or where they come from, and the differences they might have from the South or from the North, or, from a different country even. That at the heart of it, we're really having a failure in our country. And we see this now with the violence against Asian Americans, of being able to see the dignity in one another and get to know one another and have conversations with one another, and allow for that freedom of conscience that was so important to your father and your family. So I went a long time, but I would love now, just, one of the things that came out of all of that experience for your father, and that's where I got to meet you, was at the Washington Times Foundation. So how did that experience lead him then to want to start a newspaper? So, because I'm sure that there was a connection. Will you tell me about that and how that came about? Because I'm sure that kind of connects all of the things that I was just sharing.
Yeah, well, my father is a huge believer of the importance of freedom of speech. And so he felt that just having one newspaper in the heart of Washington, D.C., or the capital of the United States, is not something that's good. And so he wanted to make sure that there was another voice, so that in between these two voices, people can make up their mind as to what's really going on. And he wanted to fight for he wanted to, I think, warn the American people about the dangers of communism. He suffered under a communist regime. He was thrown in prison. And the problem with a communist ideology is it denies the existence of God, which means if you don't understand or believe in God, you don't understand how important human life is. You don't understand the value of human life. We're just one cogs in a wheel. And so he believed that human beings were divine creatures, and we have to be responsible sons and daughters. And he felt that a lot of the promises of communism, such as equality, economic equality, between the sexes. I mean, these are all very, very attractive themes, but they rarely materialize in terms of it actually being the practices of the regime. And so he wanted to warn people against communism, and yet at the same time make sure that there is an alternative voice in our nation's capital. And so he was able to do a lot of this through the Washington Times Foundation. And to this day, my mother is continuing my father's work by working through different organizations like UPF to make sure that there's continual dialogue and talks regarding reunification, and hopefully we can see that in our lifetime.
Can you tell me, so one of the things that I don't think most people know about the Washington Times, it was really founded because there was a lack of diversity of opinion in Washington. Like you said, there was only one place to speak, and there were no alternative voices, and there were really no conservative voices to talk about this, the challenges of free speech around the world. And like you said, in North Korea, I mean, people were being silenced. There was no respect for human life. And without that foundation, because we see this right now in our schools and in our society, people are putting forward these Marxist communist ideas as though they should help us overcome racism. But like your father saw firsthand, if you want to overcome these challenges, you do it on a basis of human dignity, of seeing the value of human life. As you expressed it, you don't do it by saying that life is somehow dependent on the Marxist theory of oppressed and oppressors and different classes of societies. That's not the way you actually get to it. And so creating this vehicle for more free thought and freedom of expression and diversity in this marketplace of ideas in Washington was really critical for that. And that was, so when I actually first got to meet you in person, having, worked with the church and with the community for a number of years, that was when I first met you, was when the Washington Times Foundation actually hosted an event talking about the issue of freedom of religion and belief and expression around the world and how it was under threat, and then in particular related to North Korea. And it's got to be one of the worst examples in the world of what happens when we lose these freedoms.
Yes. You are silenced, you are repressed, you have no value. The party is the supreme. So it's everything for the party. Human beings, each human life has absolutely no value. And so we have over 25 million people that are still living and suffering through the dictatorial regime of North Korea. And so even though I'm a US citizen, I was born in Korea. And so I see myself as an American, but also as a Korean. Even though the Korean War ended and an armistice agreement was signed between North Korea, US, and China, South Korea never signed off on it. And so technically, the war has never did. And so you have to understand that for South Koreans, we are still living day to day in a state of war. And so imagine what that does to a psyche of a Korean person. And on top of that, many of our relatives is the North. So you have millions of people living in South Korea who have never met their nieces and nephews or great grandmothers or grandmothers, or some parents were torn apart. And so we as a country divided, we cannot stand.
What kind of like spiritual meaning would this have for the church to see North and South Korea reunited, or just even just for the people?
I think it's more than just the spiritual significance. I think it's the conscience of the Korean people in wanting to see their country united. We have always seen ourselves as one people, and we feel that the external forces or different countries made a decision on behalf of Korea to divide the country. And there's a natural inclination of the Korean people in wanting to be our own determinator in terms of our own national interests. And so I think what my father wants, and the reason why he was really stressing for reunification, was we have to find a way to reunify North and South Korea without bloodshed.
When I was working for a congressman from Arizona, I think when I'd met you, there was a young man who had a North Korea prayer network in Arizona at the time. He was going to college there. You might remember him. And he decided to walk across the border into North Korea to go pray with the people there. And of course, he was taken captive and, tortured. And I remember, so it was in between moving from, I was in one congressional office and I went to work in a different one. And so I had a few months, or like a month gap. And I remember it being during Christmas time and reading this news article about this young man named Robert Park that just walked across the border. And I thought, that couldn't be him. And then literally a month later, I was reading another article about this guy who had just been released by the North Koreans miraculously. And I thought that couldn't be him. So when I went to work back on the Hill, I reached out to him, and again, or maybe he reached out to me and said, I want to come meet with you. And he came and he met, and he was not the same person as I had seen before. It was, and I said, Robert, what happened? I mean, you walked across the border, and he realized, it probably wasn't the best thing to do. Sadly, when he went across the border, somebody that was going to go in with him decided not to go in with him. And then later on, when Robert had come out, found that young man felt so guilty that he ended up going in after him to try to find him. But that young man was held for about 8 months, whereas Robert was held for just a couple of months. And it was so fascinating for me. He was severely tortured, but he had such a resilience that he just wanted to love the North Korean people. And he said, and he literally resolved to them, which is one of the reasons I think they let him go. Torture me all you want. I'm just here to love you, to pray for you. I'm just here to love you and pray for you. And I think it was because of that, maybe, that they ended up they couldn't break his will. He kind of was resolved that I'm here to be a martyr to you and to your country. I want you to know that he's Korean, and they let him go. And sadly, his friend, Ajalon Gomez, didn't come out. We ended up being able to get someone that was going to go over there and help bring him out, because it was always very difficult to get people out of North Korea. But the family ended up saying, no, please don't get involved. The US government says they'll handle it. And sadly, it took many more months for him to be released. And I can only imagine what happened to him, because we haven't heard from him since. But I remember seeing how traumatized Robert had been going through what he went through, and just thinking this has got to be one of the most brutal regimes we've ever seen in human history. The way that
Yeah.
they torture and terrorize people. And yet at the same time, seeing this resolve within a young Korean American that those are still my people. That's still
Mhm.
like, I want to see what the freedom we have here. I want to see the North Korean people have it. And in Congress, as you may know, I had helped lead North Korea Freedom Week every year in Congress, where we would bring in defectors that would share these just horrific stories of what happened and how they had suffered and how they had escaped. And um, it's unlike any country in the world, where it just feels like you're living in a twilight zone. And so for anyone that doesn't know what's happening in North Korea, they should just read something about it to better understand how it feels like the lights have gone out since the separation, and since the division. And the people of the North have literally been living in this dark period for 70 years now, is it?
Mhm.
Where th- and they need freedom. And so
Mhm.
it's so important that we don't forget and that we figure out how can we move towards a place where these people will be free finally, because no one in the world, especially in the 2000s, should be living under such darkness and oppression. And um, so your dad actually went over there even after everything he experienced.
Mhm.
He actually went back to North Korea and met with the government. How in the world did that happen? What can you I would love to hear about that, because that's something that, I mean, most people can't do. So
Well, he finally met Kim Il Sung December 8th, 1991. This is North Korea, mind you. And, the Chuche philosophy is their religion. But in front of these top officials, my father started preaching the failures of the Chuche philosophy, basically saying how this is not the philosophy that North Korea needs to take it to the next millennium. And because it denies the existence of God, you have no understanding of the existence, the value of human life, and so on and so forth. And he supposedly, I was not there, but I was told that he preached with such fervor that Kim Il sung was actually in the other room listening to the whole event. And he said to himself, how dare this guy come to North Korea and actually challenge and talk about the failures of our Juche philosophy. This man is waiting to be shot. This man is waiting to be executed on the spot. And so he had to meet him. And then when they met, they realized that they share the same, hobbies. They're from, my father is a North Korean. And again, touching upon the humanity. And so just the fact that my father ended up meeting with Kim Il sung was not scheduled, but he did meet with Kim Il sung. And Kim Il sung was so impressed by my father that he gave his personal helicopter and chartered my father to his hometown so that he could meet his extended family, existing extended family. And before my father left, my asked for several things. He asked for continual work, communication, and dialogue with the ultimate purpose of reunification. But the first thing that he wanted to see was a cultural exchange of the best of North Korea with the best of South Korea. So the best of North Korean students from their top art school there were allowed to come to South Korea to perform and spend a week in South Korea. And the little angels representing South Korea were able to go to North Korea, perform. And the Little Angels dance troupe was a dance troupe that was founded by my father. And he called them the peace ambassadors. And they've traveled around the world. They've entertained Queen Elizabeth and other royals, as well as different presidents. And so they were seen as very much the ambassador of Korea, South Korea. So they got to represent Korea in North Korea. And so my father was asking for continued cultural exchange, educational exchange, and at the same time allowing families to communicate with the lost relatives or family members that they could not talk for decades because of the division of North and South Korea. And the interesting thing was, Kim Il Sung said that he would allow a cultural exchange, but he carried through. And so there's a wonderful documentary that was made on the North Korean students visiting South Korea for a week, and South Korean students visiting North Korea for a week. And when my father met with Gorbachev, he asked for the same thing. He said, please allow for a cultural exchange. So the top students from Russia were allowed to come to the United States for education seminars and to kind of visit the country, and vice versa. So this all took place with the supports and with the guidance of Reagan and President Bush. But this is something that I know that my father would like to see continue. Because, as you say, it's the fear, it's the terror of the other that prevents anyone from doing anything. But somebody has to be willing to take that first scary step and say, we don't like what you're doing, but let's find a way to somehow start talking. And what better way to do that other than, through young children who are probably our best ambassadors. And I learned from my child, born 9, every day, I mean, to him, it's kind of interesting because his father is Norwegian, and I am Korean and a citizen of the United States. So when people ask him, it's like, what's your nationality? He says, I'm Norwegian, Korean, and American. He really has no concept of just belonging to one country. And when people say, oh, what race are you? Where are you from? He says, it's yes. I'm me. He has no understanding he's half white or half Asian. And I think that's the beauty of really international families, because the children grow up not seeing the walls, not seeing the divisions, not seeing the differences. They are who they are. And so us seeing ourselves as North Korean versus South Korean, we're Korean. And if we can concentrate on that message and work towards that becoming a reality, I think we can see reunification in our lifetime.
Well, I certainly hope and pray that we do, for the sake of everyone. And I think that the steps that you're taking are so important to help us get there. And there's going to be a lot of work to be done once things do change and the North does open up. And so I think it's important for all of us to be prepared for those times. Often we just think that democracy just happens overnight, but it doesn't. It's a long, hard process. And so, I mean, one of the things that, Hardwired has done in many countries around the world is a lot of countries get these new constitutions when they become free, and they think, oh, we've got it, we know how to do it. And they don't, because these values are not culturally embedded, or they've been taught otherwise for so long. They haven't understood, And so we walk through, in a local cultural context, how can you understand these freedoms? How does this relate to your culture and your history, to your um, communities and families? And how can you embrace them and understand them and articulate them yourselves, not just from an outside perspective, but how can you adopt them? Because um, these values have to be culturally ingrained and understood. And
Mhm.
sadly, in North Korea for 70 years now, they've been taught, like you said, that this Juche ideology of a really worship of the the the
Kim family,
yeah, the
yes.
Kim family. And so um and they've not been permitted to have any freedom of thought or conscience otherwise. And so coming out of that and rethinking everything that they've been taught is going to take a long time. Um and the South Korean people are going to be really vital to helping them reconnect with their history and their roots and who they want to be as a people. So uh
Mhm.
anyway, thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah.
everything
The
that you
interesting
shared.
thing about that, yeah, the interesting thing about that is that, the North Korean regime was able to control the North Korean people for this long because they controlled information. But now with the internet and organizations like the Human Rights Foundation or the Oslo Freedom Forum, by Thor Halvorsen, they're doing an incredible job of just sending USB drives, flying it in
Yeah.
to North Korea. And so what this allows is for new information that a lot of the people didn't have, instead of seeing the West as evil, satanic, they are families just like you, and we love great singing and entertainment just like you. And I
Yeah.
think it's so funny that even when the Berlin Wall came down and a lot of people got a chance to go into the buildings that occupied by the regime on the eastern side, there were evidence of people listening to Beatles and Western music. And so that's the power of culture, right?
Yeah.
As much as you want to control, you cannot change people from wanting culture, from wanting to celebrate their divinity through the arts, and because it's what allows us to be like God or like Christ, in that we can create this beautiful painting, create this incredible music, or create this incredible dance, and it's a celebration of who we are as divine beings. And so I know that not just the Human Rights Foundation, but in other ways, there's a very vibrant black market economy in North Korea that I think the West has to be cognizant of. So no amount of sanction is going to have the kind of effect that we would like to see, because there's a thriving black market economy. And so the ones who know how to operate in that black market economy are doing well, but the rest of the population are suffering and are starving and are being repressed and, just living in hell.
Yeah.
So it's really a question of what can we do? What steps can we take to help um, liberate North Korea, really, and
Yeah.
bring them into the next millennium.
Well,
Mhm.
and Tatiana, one last thing that I'm really curious about. When President Trump went and sat down with um, the leader of North Korea, how how did how was that perceived in the world? Because um, I mean, it was such an unusual thing to happen. Like with your father, even meeting Kim Un Sung, like this was very this was a really momentous kind of occasion that doesn't happen too often. I mean, usually when somebody goes in there, it's to rescue somebody out, like a prisoner, like I mentioned. It's not to sit down and dialogue. So, how
Mhm.
symbolic and important was that?
I think from the Korean point of view, any movement or any dialogue forward is seen as a positive step. Of course, whether it was a positive step or not, that remains to be seen, because what is being done after that meeting, or what is being continued, or what kind of a dialogue is continuing on, that's the big question. And so the Biden administration has a very big responsibility now, and we will have to see what steps they will take, whether they will build upon President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un, move the process forward, or whether they want to take a different approach. We are all watching very closely.
But I think the positive thing out of all of this is knowing that dialogue and interaction and breaking down walls is critical.
Yes.
And so, we don't want that progress to end. We want it to continue for the freedom of so many people who need it over there. So, Tatiana.
Right. So I'm sure you remember, Tina, that it was President Reagan who proclaimed to Gorbachev, tear down the wall 2 years before the Berlin Wall came down. So who is going to be the president now who's going to basically say the same thing, tear down the wall, and usher in a movement towards the reunification of North and South Korea?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of walls and barriers that need to be torn down in the world today. And, they're not just physical. And that's really what this dialogue was all about, was about how can we as human beings tear down those walls with one another and begin to see the humanity in one another and treat each other differently. So anyway, thank you.
Well,
Tatiana.
thank you, Tina.